about accents today. How many of you think that New York City has an accent? Raise your hand. Yeah, most of it. You've heard the New York City accent. Yeah. How about here in Columbus? Do we have an accent here? I see a couple. No. What about Cleveland? Do they have an accent in Cleveland? Yeah, I see some. Not as many as New York, though. I want to talk about that. How do we figure out who has an accent and who doesn't have an accent? We have kind of mixed feelings about accents in this country. So on the one hand, when we have an accent, sometimes it grounds us and we feel like, you know, you're an authentic New Yorker. You're a real Bostonian. You're a real Southerner if you have the accent. But we also talk like having an accent is in some ways not quite as good as not having an accent. When I talk to people about places that they think don't have accents, they like to use words like educated or clear or so American anybody can understand it. My favorite example is a guy from Dayton I interviewed who said, people in Columbus and Dayton talk like God talks. It's just normal. As a sociolinguist, the technical term we use for that is linguistic security, when you know that your speech is correct. And people in Ohio seem to have a lot of it. They have a lot of linguistic security. And one of the things that I am interested in is trying to figure out how'd they get that? Where did that come from? Our friend from Dayton, he can give us a clue. Right after he name checks God, he goes on with the next logical person. He says, and we used to say, Walter Cronkite. And he's not the only one. A lot of people in Ohio will tell you that newscasters get sent here to Ohio to learn how to talk because people talk so clear here. And it's really interesting that they say that because it turns out that newscasters do have a lot to say, or have a lot to do with how Ohio got to be standard, but not in the way that they think. So the first thing that I want you guys to get is that when we talk about correct English or standard French or any kind of standard version of a language, we're not really talking about the way people talk. We're not describing aspects of language that linguists like me can get a hold of. We're talking about the social history of a language, and that social history can happen in different ways. So if we look at England or we look at France, the language that's seen as the most educated and the best language, you're going to be really shocked by this, is the language that the people in power were speaking, right? So there's a reason they call it the Queen's English. You have lots of different ways of speaking in different parts of the country, but when you get together and decide, well, what's the correct way, it turns out that the person who's king or queen, they kind of get to win, right? That's why it's good to be king, right? So that's what happened in England, that happened in France. What we think of now as standard British English or standard French, most of those features come from Paris or from London, right? But it doesn't always happen that way. So for example, in Iceland, when they started standardizing Icelandic, they just gained their independence from Denmark, and they were feeling kind of down on the Danes. They were really grouchy about them. And so there was this sense that the people in the cities, the more powerful people, their language had been kind of corrupted or contaminated by contact with those Danes that they were so mad at. So it was the speech of the rural areas that had less power that were taken as the standard because they were seen as pure, right? Something similar happened in this country. So for the first half or so of our time as a country, we didn't have a single American Standard English. Instead, there were regional standards. So if you wanted to sound educated, you wanted to sound good, you tried to sound like the rich people in whatever area you happened to be from. So if you were in New York and you wanted to sound educated, you tried to sound like a Roosevelt. So listen to the way Teddy here says his R's in term and party.
They can make terms with the bosses who dominate the Republican Party.
Right? He doesn't have a lot of R's there, terms and party, right? But if you were in Ohio and you wanted to sound educated, you could say your R's. So listen to Taft here.
I am willing to admit that war has accomplished much in the progress of the world.
Right, so he says war. He's got an R on him, right? And that was fine. You just sounded like where you were from. And all that kept going until about the first half of the last century, when radio technology got powerful enough that you could have a nationwide news broadcast. And that's kind of exciting, right? Everybody listening to the same news. But how are they going to talk, right? Because newscasters, they're supposed to be trustworthy. What voice is going to make everybody across the country listen in and say, oh yeah, I trust you, you're educated, you're clear, I know what you're talking about? Well, the people that got to decide how the newscasters should sound, they said to themselves, this is great. Do you realize that we get to invent American Standard English? They probably didn't say it like that because it was a while ago and they were kind of fancy, right? But that's what they were thinking. They were thinking, all right, we are going to bring the country together. We are going to have one standard language for this whole country. It's going to be different from that British standard English, I'll tell you that for one thing. And we are going to bring ourselves together as Americans. But the problem was, what should it sound like? Whose variety should win? Well, they were in New York, so you might think they'd pick New York, because then they wouldn't have to change the way they spoke. Or you could imagine they might pick Washington, D.C., right, because there's a seat of political power. But we had something kind of like Iceland going on here, where at the time that this decision was being made, it was a time of one of our periodic panics that we like to have in this country about immigration. And at the time, everyone was kind of freaking out about immigration from Eastern Europe and how it was changing or contaminating the East Coast cities in the US. And so they said, wait a second, what about the Midwest? That has a nice feel to it. There's not so many scary immigrants. The immigration history of the Midwest was a bit older at the time. And they thought, I really like the idea of the Midwest. You know, there's a lot of sort of Nordic farmers striding around, and we really like that idea. So let's go with the Midwest. And they very consciously picked this area to get to be the standard. And they started training their newscasters to sound like they were from here. So that worked out really well for people in Ohio, because now y'all get to be the good talkers, right? The way you're supposed to sound. So go you. But it turns out there's a linguistic twist to this story, because Ohio's migration history left it with a dialect boundary running right through the upper half, right? So this is a map from the Atlas of North American English. It's based on vowel patterns that are changing right now. So Ohioans in different parts of the state are getting more and more different from each other. So right here where we are now, we're in Columbus, we're in what we call the Midland, and it's changing in a way that sounds a bit like this young woman. Listen particularly to the way she says the word class.
You know, I'm in classes now that are bigger than my entire class in my high school.
So if you're from here, that might not sound remarkable at all, because this is how people are talking here, right? It's a little bit different than the way I say class. She's got a bit more like class, right? But I've got a young woman from the Cleveland area. She's going in kind of a different direction. She sounds a bit different. So listen to how she says class.
Everyone's like, you know, how far do you have to walk to your class? I'm like 10 minutes, whatever, you know.
Right? So class and class. There are a few other differences, but we'll just take that for now. So the challenge is, y'all got to be standard, right? You were defined as the Walter Cronkites of America. Congratulations. But now you're talking differently from each other. What are we going to do about that? Who gets to stay standard? Who gets to stay normal? Well, that's what my research is about. How are we dealing with that, right? And it turns out that what you think depends on where you live. And there's also still a lot of disagreement. So if you talk to Central Ohioans, this is a map of a perceptual map made by a whole bunch, it's a composite made by a whole bunch of Central Ohioans and a few Southern Ohioans in the mix, where I asked them to draw where people spoke differently. And you can see this beautiful lighter area in the center of the state. This is Central Ohioans' boundless faith in a place called Central Ohio. It is a place that you don't really need to describe so much. That's why it's lighter, because there's nothing to say. This is the place where we all talk just like God and Walter Cronkite, right? But you can see that the lower part of the state and the upper part of the state, those are darker, because some Central Ohioans, about 2/3 of them, are starting to kick Northern Ohio out of the club. And they're going to say, yeah, I have noticed that those people in Cleveland, they talk a little funny. I've noticed that now that you say it. And about 1/3, they still don't notice it. And they just say, yeah, us in Cleveland, we're all the same. Of course, we'll note that everybody kind of agrees that Southern Ohio has its own way of talking, right? That's another TED Talk. So what are the Northerners doing? Well, this is their map. So one of the things we can see is they don't believe in Central Ohio nearly as much as Central Ohioans do. But they also don't seem to have their own spot. They don't seem to say, oh yeah, we're just all normal, because they're disagreeing a lot more. So 1/3 of them join the 1/3 of the Central Ohioans in saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Us in Columbus, we're all the same. Yeah, we all talk the same, right? Another 1/3 say, yeah, we're kind of different. We talk a little funny, right? Their linguistic security is taking a hit. As one woman said, after I have a couple glasses of wine, I get really nasal, right? So they're taking that on for themselves. And then the last 1/3, they're my favorite, because they're what I call the resistors. They're saying, yes, I have noticed that those Columbus people talk funny, now that you mention it. Or as one woman says in a study that I looked at of how people talk about accents on Twitter, she said, I am sick of being told I have an accent. Bitch, I'm from Cleveland. You have the accent. For all you Clevelanders out there, right? And what I love about those folks is that they're actually the most northern. So when I use fancy linguistic tools to look at their speech, they're actually doing more of the class and less of the class, right, than the other northerners, the ones who are more aware of it. So what's the point of all of this? We don't actually know whether Cleveland has an accent, not because scientists like me haven't figured it out yet, but because y'all haven't worked it out yet. It's still up in the air. Maybe we're going to have an accent in Cleveland, and maybe we're not. We haven't finished that conversation. So what I'd like to leave you guys with is the idea that you actually have an influence on two big things. One is who has an accent. Are you guys going to continue to have the idea that say, hey, Cleveland really has an accent, or Columbus, maybe we could get the Columbus accent going. That'd be kind of fun, right? Start it here, right? But the other thing that these conversations impact is not just who has an accent, but what does it mean to have an accent? Every time that you listen to somebody and you talk about their speech and you make judgments about them based on how they sound and what you think that says about who they are and what their life is like, you're not just describing the world. You're making it new each time. You're deciding, what does it mean in this country to have an accent? And the more we move to the idea that having an accent kind of means that it's just, your speech isn't quite as good, what we're doing is we're pushing people to a choice between sounding like where they're from and sounding educated. Is that really a choice that we want people to make in this country? Do we really want to say that we want everybody to sound the same all the time? Because personally, I think it's super fun when you can listen to people and they sound different. Thank you.